How does God prove his faithfulness? If we look at Abraham and we hear about his covenant, God's covenant with Abraham, that covenant was a long-lasting covenant. It's a covenant that is still with us today. The covenant was basically that Abraham would be a blessing to the nations. God would bless everyone who was born of him and everyone who is spiritually born of him. And my question is, how do we pray like that? Do we consider what God would be faithful to in maybe 3 or 4 generations' time? If we look at Abraham, we realize God gave him a covenant, one which would only be fulfilled about 400 years later. And so my question is, how do we pray? Do we pray that long in advance? Do we pray and ask God to be faithful to our descendants 400, maybe 300 years later? How far into the future do we look to see how God will show his faithfulness to us? Do we think that far into the future? Maybe some people might look about a year into the future. Maybe some people would look about 10 days into the future. Maybe not even one day, maybe a few hours into the future, depending on what it is that we are needing. Think about God's faithfulness. How far do we look? How far do we see how faithful God is to his people? Well, when we look at Abraham, we see that God said that he would be the father of many nations. Only now, when we look back, we see that not through his direct son Isaac, not through his son Jacob, but through Jacob's sons. In fact, not even there. When we look at Jacob's offspring and the 12 tribes of Israel, those came through Jacob's sons. So that was at least 4 generations on that God properly fulfilled his covenant. And how do we see Abraham respond? He believed God, and God credited to him as righteousness. Abraham trusted God. There was no need for Abraham to doubt what God had said. God had told Abraham that's what he would do. And by looking back, Abraham could see God is trustworthy, God is faithful to keep his covenant. So when he told Abraham that he would make him the father of many nations, Abraham believed him. He looked back, he saw how God had been so faithful and trustworthy to keep his promises. And Abraham believed God, even though he knew that he would never see the culmination of that covenant. But yet, how do we pray? How do we think? How do we ask God's faithfulness? Do we look 10 minutes into the future? Do we look an hour into the future? And yes, those are really good. But do we ever consider maybe praying a couple of generations into the future? Or do we just think very short term? God is faithful to keep doing what he does. He is trustworthy to keep his covenant, and we should ask him to do such things.